Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast with me, Liam Bishop, curating the best writers to inspire you and your writing. Now, a high income, an Ivy League degree, a comfortable life in Dubai. If I were to offer those to you, would you take them? Well, that's what the narrator of Uttama Kirit Patel's novel, The Shape of an Apostrophe, has. But life is not what it seems for Lina. Lina is pregnant, and she's finding that this seemingly salubrious society is not congenial and accommodating to the difficult challenges of an unplanned pregnancy. Surrounded by complex family dynamics, it becomes a question of what kind of environment Lina's child will be brought into. Uttama was born to Gujarati parents who then found their way to the United Arab Emirates via Kampala, Surat, Pondicherry, and Colchester. Uttama now lives in Thailand and has lived in a whole host of other cities. Her short fiction was nominated for the Penn Robert J. Dau Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers. She was also a semi-finalist for the Raymond Carver Short Story Prize. But Shape of an Apostrophe is her first novel. Uttama, absolutely delighted to have you on the podcast. Welcome to the Rippling Pages.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Please, you have lived in, I mean, that isn't even the full extent of everywhere you lived.
There's a long list of cities mainly, but New York, London, Hong Kong, Singapore. There's a short time in Toronto, and currently in Thailand.
Is it work that takes you there, or writing, or just
different things over different things. Sometimes universities, work, love,
wow.
change of scene, change of pace, which is what's brought us to Thailand. So yeah, I think there's different reasons taken me to each place. But
so whereabouts in Thailand is it? I don't know Thailand very well, but
it's in Phuket,
okay.
which is one of the islands. So compared to Bangkok, which is the main city, Thailand is nice, and yeah, that definitely an island life versus a city life.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
It's making me jealous. I know. Well, you're in London at the moment anyway, and Uttama's in London at the moment, and that's where we're chatting from. Okay, let's get going. Before we do, remember to like, share, follow, subscribe, or leave a review if you enjoyed today's episode or any other previous episode. Can you just explain a little bit more then about the situation that Lina finds herself in?
Lina is someone who never wanted to be a mother. She has never sort of placed motherhood or parenthood at the center of her identity, and she finds herself unexpectedly pregnant. So she's been married just over a year. She lives what she believes is temporarily with her in-laws in their big Dubai mansion, in a sort of joint family setup. And she finds herself unexpectedly pregnant and also living in Dubai where there's limited reproductive autonomy. So she has basically faced with a situation and is really considering, what choice she's going to make and to what extent she's going to go to stick to her decision.
When we're talking about limited reproductive rights, do you mind me asking what that is?
Yeah, so, the right to an abortion, I think there's only certain circumstances under which that is allowed. And it's not as relevant to Lina's case because she is married, but there's also sort of limited reproductive rights based on whether you're married or whether you're single. It is specific to Dubai, but there's lots of places in the world that have those kind of limitations, particularly relevant at the moment. But I would say that in the novel, that's one of the factors that just kind of plays into how much agency she feels she has. It isn't really a big factor in her decision making, but just sort of feeling like, can I even make choices around this? And if I did, what would they look like? And where would I, act on those choices with the freedom that I might want?
Yeah. So is that the reason then that you set the novel in Dubai?
Set it in Dubai actually more because I wanted to use a opulent backdrop, sort of contrast that to the way that the people living within it are imprisoned in sort of expectations of other people and living up to a certain picture that they want to present. And so I found that contrast really interesting of living in this larger than life place and yet being kind of trapped in your little sphere of what is socially acceptable and whose voices are in your head when you're making decisions about your life. So it's also, I grew up in Abu Dhabi in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a part of the world that I know well and love and have seen it grow. It's quite rare to sort of grow up with a city, but I used it as a setting as well because Lina as a character has that kind of relationship with the city that she grew up in as well.
Did you then have an idea of writing a novel about, was it always about a
Yeah.
pregnant woman?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the premise of the novel, like I always knew I wanted to tell this story of a woman who just doesn't want children. And I wanted to allow that choice to exist or that want to exist without providing justification or myriad of reasons and just explore the nuance of that maternal desire or the lack of that desire. So that was always going to be the story. That was always the kind of voice I heard. And it was actually born out of I found myself writing an apology letter one day to the biological child that I had decided not to have in favor of adoption. And as I was writing, I was wondering what I was apologizing for. And I realized that even though I wanted to be a mother, I was apologizing for not wanting to be a particular type of mother and was, struck by it, offended by it, thought, women should be allowed to have those choices and all the nuances around that. So I always knew that was going to be the premise and wanted to explore that further in the story.
Wow, that's thanks for sharing that. When did you write that letter?
Oh, a long time ago, more than 10 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, more than 10 years ago, but sort of around the time soon after I got married and as I was considering, having a family in a more real way. I think, sometimes we have ideas about how we want our families to look like, but then when you're faced with the decision, it's a different thing. And I think that's also something I loved exploring with Lina. It's like she has very strong opinions about certain things and she knows what she doesn't want. But when you're actually in the physical state of being, of carrying a child, how does that change, if it changes, or what comes out of that, circumstance versus what you think you want or might want or not want.
Yeah, desire is an interesting one, isn't it? And especially in relation to Lena and her situation. I don't know if you can explain just a little bit more about desire and what you mean by what Lena wants or doesn't want.
Yeah, I think when I refer to maternal desire, of course, there's so many layers to that. But what I mean in particularly for Lena is, does she want to live that role, that identity, that practice of being a mother? Which I think for the most part, people assume all women want that or all women feel it to some degree. I think that's something that I have personally also not had like a physical ache, which many women describe as wanting to carry a child, birth a child, go through that process, which women can. And I think there's also a large number of women that don't feel that. So when I talk about want, it's both is it a physical want for, experiencing a process that is specific to women, plus the want of, nurturing, mothering, parenting a child. And in that case, it's not just specific to women, but intentional parenthood for both mothers and fathers. But in Lina's case, I really wanted to explore how she feels about, she's put in she thinks cerebrally that she doesn't want to be a mother and she doesn't want to, have a child. And then much of the novel, she is actually in the presence of the child that she is carrying. And the novel also explores that kind of the gendered expectations around parenting. So I think something that Lina also kind of pushes against is how she's expected to be in the role of mother versus what her husband is expected to do in the role of father. And the discrepancy between the two, like her husband, Dushan, is sort of given permission to shirk responsibility, whereas Lina's behavior as a mother is heavily scrutinized. I think also the physical demands and the mental labor of parenting. It's really hard to articulate that. The novel The Need by Helen Phillips does an amazing job of like, you're in this situation, you've got these children, and she has this almost cruel way of being like, I just wanted to shove a sock in their face to shut them up. And it sounds really cruel and horrible, but there are lots of moments of, you know, mothering and parenting that are raw and difficult, and they kind of take you to parts of yourself that you might not otherwise confront. I'm not sure that Lina, having prior to when we begin the story, but she actually knows the extent of that. But she has also lost her mother to complications in childbirth. So I think there's a layer there where she just, you know, she knows that there's high risk to becoming a mother as well.
I mean, that's one of the traumatic events that precedes Lina's narrative. I mean, how does that come out then? How does that evolve in the novel for Lina as she approaches the due date?
Yeah, slowly, I would say. It's sort of something that she has, I don't think she's buried so much as it's sort of a fact of her life that has just always been there. And of course, she has this really deep, special relationship with her father, who she has also lost at the start of the novel. And so I think that's really a focus, and it kind of stays that way throughout the story. But with her mother, I thought it's really interesting that I think one, of course, there's a lot of guilt that she has carried for sort of being the child that survived. And her mother was lost. And so, on the one hand, she knows what the risk of becoming a mother is. On the other, she feels culpable. And I think that guilt is an emotion that she really fights against, even as she's feeling it and doesn't want to feel it. And you know, as she learns a little bit more and more about her mother over the course of the novel, there's also relief that comes from finding out some really difficult information, because she starts to feel less guilty. So I think she's also been surrounded by these little narratives of, you know, being grateful, needing to be grateful for the choices that her mother or her father have made. And there is a kind of battle there between what she's supposed to feel and what she does feel. And she, you know, didn't have a relationship with her mother. She only has the narrative of what happened to her mother.
Perhaps as a result of this, then is it fair to say that she doesn't have the support network that she do with?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's fair to say. I think she did with her father, or maybe had the freedom to be as she is, and that's what she's lost with his loss. And then on a surface level, looks like she does have support because she's married and she's got in-laws, and there's a, you know, whole social community around that. But she doesn't have that feeling of being loved and seen, despite everything, despite changes, despite, you know, the years gone by, whatever it is that most people, more fortunate people, have with their parents.
Well, I mean, the people that she's surrounded by. So two of the main people you have mentioned, Ishan and her mother-in-law. I don't know if you can just explain their roles in the novel. Two
Yeah,
very
sure.
different and interesting characters.
Yeah, very different characters. Ishan, who is Lina's husband, who is by definition a good Indian boy and kind of likes to play by the rules, good to his family, works in the family business. He really is, compared to Lina particularly, he just kind of is. He doesn't do much self-reflection. He has a lot of good intentions but doesn't always act on them. And he's a character that a lot of people don't really like, but I think is a character that is not uncommon to see. And also, Lina and Ishan developed a relationship and a marriage in a different scenario. And then when they live with his parents, she starts to see some changes in him. And again, it comes down to, you know, what is being done to satisfy the expectation of someone else versus for themselves. So he's really like an example of that. He isn't a very strong support. I think there's love there, but I don't know that he fully understands Lina, or she doesn't feel like he does. So Auntie Em is Lina's mother-in-law, Ishan's mother, and she is a fascinating character to follow and write about. And I really wanted to share and show two strong women. Auntie Em, maybe not at the surface, but I would say that she's also a feminist in a completely different way than Lina is. And you sort of learn things about her as the story progresses. But I wanted to create a character that was, in some ways just stereotypical Indian mother-in-law. There's obviously a lot more depth to her. But I think the relationship between the mother-in-law and Lina is also something that I love to explore, because there's this narrative around it, which is around in-law relationships in general, right? You're my mother-in-law, so therefore you're like my mother, or you're my daughter-in-law, so therefore you're like my child. And I've also always found that really like a tired, reason and a unrealistic expectation. I wanted to explore and create a relationship where you don't get along. You're both really strong. You both have kind of fierce methods of doing what you want to do. And maybe that's okay. And what we really need in some of these relationships is a respect, and not a friendship, or not a child-parent relationship.
What makes her a stereotypical Indian mother-in-law?
she's very she's heavily biased towards her own son, in whom she sees no flaws.
Okay.
She imposes her opinions and, um, her way of life, and her style and her food and how to be in a situation, on her children and on her daughter-in-law. She has high standards, or specific standards, for how she would like her daughter-in-law to behave and be. And unfortunately, those expectations are kind of quite traditional and gendered, right? She wants her to maybe not work once she's become a mom, and she doesn't really take her career that seriously. And
Yeah, so when you said then that she's a feminist, why is she a feminist?
I think I wouldn't say she would call herself that, but I see that in her, because when it comes down to it, she she's unapologetically who she is, and I think that's a difference between her and Lina, where Lina sort of is trying to fight to prove that she's right, and it should be like this and it shouldn't be like that. And I think Auntie Em is just a lot more in control and in the know about what she wants and why she wants it, and I think that's feminist, and that's okay. So of course she's not perfect. There's no perfect feminist, but I think she does stand as an example of a strong woman who, yeah, lives by her standards. There's of course choices she's made, in the past, for her family, for her son, that are, fought against the challenges that she faced, and with her in-laws and whatnot. So different time, different set of circumstances, but I think she's unapologetically herself.
Yeah, you mentioned when you were speaking at the start about your choices around Lina and Lina being pregnant. You said there was I think you said something like I shouldn't have to apologize for who, not wanting to make these
Mm,
choices about not being pregnant. And then you
yeah.
use this idea here that she's a woman that shouldn't apologize for
Mm.
for who she is. I just wonder if there's a wider comment that you're making here about women and women in society.
Yeah, I think so. I A lot of women feel like, I don't know, if not apology, then at least that they need to provide justification for their decisions, right? And there is absolutely a pairing that is imposed on women between in motherhood, or about motherhood, and selfishness. Like, if you've chosen not to have children, that is you're somehow making a selfish choice. So definitely, I think in the situation of parenthood and motherhood, there's so much that people are expecting women to explain. And I think it is not the same for men when they say they don't want to be fathers. I don't think they're asked what they owe the world, and wasn't that a selfish choice that they were going to focus on their career instead, or whatever it is. So yeah, I think there's a lot more explaining, justifying, apologizing, whether it's a direct apologizing or just, apologizing to oneself even, and carrying that guilt of why you've made certain choices. That I think is a wider thing for women.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, your novel it's asking those questions, I think. And some of these, well, obviously these attitudes are pervasive, aren't they? They're archaic and pervasive. I'll tell you what we'll do, Uttama, we'll have a quick break on the rippling pages. Do come back after the break, though. Obviously, you need to come back, Uttama, so we can carry on talking to you about. Our listeners can come back as well, because we're going to be talking more about the shape of an apostrophe. See you soon. Did you know that there is a Rippling Pages bookshop? It's not a real bookshop, but it is online and it's hosted by bookshop.org.uk. There you can access all of the books of the Rippling Pages guests, including Uttama's. To get there, follow the link in the show notes. And the best bit, all the books are sourced from independent bookshops, which means not only are you supporting the writers we have on the show, but you're also supporting indie bookshop. Okay, let's get back into it, and let's get back to the shape of an apostrophe with Uttama Patel. Hi, Uttama, welcome back. Welcome back to you, the listener. We're going to get back into the shape of an apostrophe. Well, what I found, there's lots of images of sea life, and you talk about, at one point I think you talk about octopuses. There's a part where you talk about seahorses. I just wondered, were these some of your ways into, beyond sort of bold metaphors about what you're talking about, were these some other ways into some of the themes that you were writing about?
I explored that sort of sea life, other creatures, how forms reproduce, but also because, without giving too much away in the novel, it is an unusual relationship between Lina, her father, her mother. It's not just a typical, mother, father, child, straight biological relations between the three of them. And in the exploration of these creatures, it's just looking at other examples of how to be family or how to be parents. And we often, I think, again, stick to quite traditional gendered notions of who carries responsibility, who carries physical. And so I just wanted to explore those to show that there is diversity in this, in other creatures, and we may not be physically able to change how we do that, but in our relationships and the roles that we play, we can.
Definitely, yeah. It was a reference point for the reader, but it felt like there were reference points for Lina as well, and reference points for pregnancy and relations, but also a reference point back to her father, as you said. And as I think about it now, it makes me think she's finding a way through this, and she lost these two substantial, figures in her life before this. Ihsan is, sometimes doesn't really match up to expectations, does he? And obviously, Auntie Ems is really dominating presence, but she's trying to help her. But it felt like Lina was lost, and there is a point in the book, in a really crucial moment, where you write the word "lost," and it's a really significant moment.
That's spot on. She's lost. She is lost through, I would say, most of the novel, and in different ways. But I think the reason for her being lost, and what I'm sort of exploring with the themes in the novel, is so long as she's trying to satisfy somebody else's want and expectation and acceptance and whatnot, she's lost. I think what I'm trying to get at with the end and the ending is, sometimes you have to really be in a position of everything has been stripped from you, and then you are finally left with yourself. And then you might find that home and that sense of, belonging or being rooted to yourself, which I think Lina does not have until the very end.
Well, that's really powerful, and it is a really powerful ending. But yeah, beside that, obviously, Lina is incredibly resilient to what's going on.
There's also a reason that Lina's like a really strong character who is, she's educated, she's successful, she's by many definitions a really powerful woman. And that's also as an intentional choice, using a character like that who can still feel not good enough, not fitting in, not having a voice, and particularly in the domestic sphere. I think there's lots of men and women who can have really powerful voices on a podium and be really feeble at home. And that's why I've honed in on a family and a home, to look at that, like the domestic sphere as a place that's kind of reflecting these wider shortcomings. And I think it's a prime opportunity in a space where we can change that, but we don't often change that.
Yeah, definitely. But shapes, lines, traces, there are lots of these in the novel too. And, the title alludes to this idea of a sort of tracing a shape.
With Lina being an artist, and, she sketches portraits in charcoal. So there's a kind of literal use of the shapes and tracing. And one of the things I was looking at was how I wanted to show those, bodies and those shapes and those faces, and they're her father's and her babies. And I wanted to show the sort of transitory nature of those forms, kind of pulling into the theme of our internal self versus our external self. And, there's a point, there's her father's cremation. There's a point in the novel which is almost like what she feels is a second cremation. And Lina starts to come to terms with this idea that what she had held onto was the form of her father and the body of her father. So there's definitely use of those shapes and some of that imagery to think about, to the kind of permanent versus transitory nature of our bodies and what's important. And I'd like to think that Lina had a more fluid sense of self as the novel progresses. And then, of course, there's the form that's growing in her own body. And this, when she starts in the start of her pregnancy, she's very much sees the child inside her as an outsider. Like, this is an external form and shape that lives here. And then how do some of those boundaries blur as her relationship changes, including, the change of her own body, but then what's happening physically to her baby as well.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting it's just quite interesting that the way that you write about it. On the flight back from Bombay, she'd drawn the taunting clouds that shaped into a limb, an oddly crooked toe, and untethered nose. It speaks of her thinking about her child and what's going to come.
She's a visual thinker.
Mm.
Yeah, she's a visual thinker. So I think that some of those images are just, like they're sometimes disjointed, they may be disturbing. And I think that's kind of reflective of her state of mind sometimes as she's thinking of them.
Do you think that we are, disjointed as people, as bodies sometimes, or does it reflect kind of deeper idea that Lina maybe has?
I think we can be, but I think more, I'd say that we put a lot of importance on our bodies, and it's almost because it's the easiest one to see. And, particularly in the world that Lina is in, there's so much commentary around, skin color, body weight, all this, right? I've kind of shown some of that around the community in the Bay that she is part of. And so there's a fixation with our bodies that I actually think is quite limiting. And if we were to look at it in a more disjointed way, or in a more, I don't know, in just a different way, or maybe be more open to the purpose of our bodies and what they're there for and what role they play. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit to gain from that. Yeah, It's a good question. There's more there. I'm just thinking of it.
Okay, I'm going to say, what do you think there is to be gained?
Freedom. Freedom, I think, is to be gained from not being hyperfixated on our bodies. And that's something that is a big lesson and power that comes from grief. Because as soon as if you've ever witnessed a person pass, you absolutely understand how useless a body is to what is important. And I don't mean to discredit that we need to take care of our health and our physical body, but in how we attach ourselves to people and to ideas, I think or our perception of ourselves, we're so concerned about how it's going to come across and how we're going to be seen. And I think if we would just remember that body is just a dimensional form that carries what's inside of us, it would be a lot more freeing. I think I was going to say, especially for women who are more scrutinized for their bodies, but I think it's the same for men. Going back to the idea of choosing motherhood, I mean, there's also this idea that because we have this body, we owe the world a baby because we can make one. I mean, that's like that's a larger one. But yeah, I think absolutely in the world that Lina is in, there's how she dresses, her hair is curly, she's darker skinned, and I think the more importance that's given on that makes a person more conscious of that, takes them away from the parts of their inner selves that they should rather be paying more attention to. It just takes them longer to get there, as it's taken Lina a long time in the process to get to that towards the end, where suddenly she realizes, okay, none of this stuff is important. But it shouldn't have to take, I think, so much.
Yeah, values are ascribed to aesthetics, aren't they? Becomes associated with a lot of things. I don't know if you could just round off by maybe just reflecting on your writing journey. I think there's well, not version, but I've seen these characters before in some of your short stories. I wonder if you just had any reflections about the writing journey and and where it's got you to.
Well, the novel, started off as a short story called Grinch in Girigun. So the characters in that short story, you'd recognize Lina's in there, Shobha, Raja, some of the same characters. And I wrote that story, didn't really love it, but my teacher at the time suggested, lots of people responding really well to it, consider taking a novel writing class. So I did. I showed up to that novel writing class. The assignment on that day was to just write the first paragraph of your novel. And I'm pleased to say it's the same one. It's the same one that the novel starts with. It took me about 7 years to write the novel. I was working in a corporate marketing job, so I used to write every Saturday, and then had about 8 weeks at a time when I disconnected from technology and went off to New Zealand by myself and wrote what I think was the better parts of the novel. Writing for me, absolutely more joyous than the other parts of the process. I would say that, people don't always love to talk about publishing, but I found the part about finding an agent and kind of a home for the book was a particular challenge with this story. Specifically, agents not knowing where to place it, the market, the country. Also, the idea that being a brown writer, that I had some sense of responsibility for representing the community, or I refused to kind of bend to some of those suggestions. And so it took me a longer time to find an agent. Of course, when I did, it was speedy and smooth. And then it found a lovely home with Serpent's Tail. But
yeah, I'm glad. Well, I'm glad that you did that, and it's the journey that's brought you to where it is now. But I love that. I love that the first paragraph is still the first paragraph.
Yeah.
That's a really lovely little
yeah.
that's a little Easter egg for everyone. Well, it's been I mean, it has been a journey because you've traveled. Also, you've traveled pretty far and wide, and I know to hear you traveled to New Zealand as well to sort of cut off and get it written. What works for you? What works for you, isn't it? I think
exactly.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Uttama. Your novel, The Shape of an Apostrophe, is out now. But for now, Uttama, it's been my pleasure to have you on the Rippling Pages. Thanks for fitting us in as well to your schedule whilst you're over here in the UK.
Thank you so much, Liam. It's great to chat about the book and all sorts. Pleasure to be here as well.